Did you know that vinophiles in the New World are getting very, very excited about Cabernet Franc and the broad range of expressions that you can get from this grape when you vinify it as a single cultivar wine? They're also very hyped up about how places like South Africa and Argentina and Washington State are producing incredibly high quality level Cabernet Francs when bottled on their own. The sad truth, however, is that the New World has done very little to shift the focus away from Cabernet Franc's homeland of France. Here, I'll reduce the issue to numbers for you. If we look at the Loire Valley, which is really the only place in France where Cabernet Franc gets to be bottled on its own, there are about 16,000 hectares there. And when we shift our focus to Bordeaux, we see there that Cabernet Franc is more of a minor blending partner behind grapes like Merlot primarily, and also Cabernet Sauvignon. There is another roughly 16,000 hectares. So between Bordeaux and the Loire, there's just over 30,000 hectares. That 30,000 hectares accounts for 70% of all the Cabernet Franc in the entire world. So the New World has a long way to go before we can make any claim to be redefining what Cabernet Franc is as a grape. But the reason that we're discussing Cabernet Franc is because today's hand drink solo wine of the day is the Morgenster Cabernet Franc 2021 from the unofficial wine ward of the Helderberg on the southern end of the Stellenbosch wine district in South Africa. The fruit for this wine comes from 2 blocks that faced northeast on Morgenster Estate, and it was vinified by the then Morgenster winemaker Giulio van Staden. Morgenster Estate is about 300 years old, although the current owners, the Bertrand family, have only owned it since 1992. The founding Bertrand, Giulio, who has now passed on, came from Italy and wanted to build a little piece of his homeland on the southern end of the African continent. So to help him do this, he bought the piece of land and then imported a whole bunch of Italian wine cultivars like Nebbiolo, Sangiovese, and even Vermentino. On top of that, he also brought in 17 olive cultivars that were native to the Mediterranean, and so that has had the estate winning a whole bunch of olive awards as well. When it comes to their wines, they do focus on some Nebbiolo and some Sangiovese, and we've explored those wines in the Hand Drink Solo Club. I think they are well worth hunting down. But if we are to be honest about the purple patch of their critical acclaim, this all lies around their classic Bordeaux-style red blends made of grapes like Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot. A few months ago, we discussed the Lawrence River blend, which is a Merlot-fronted Bordeaux red blend. I still think it's one of the best value red blends in Stellenbosch. And then they have the Morgenster Reserve, which is a little step up as far as the price is concerned, but this Cabernet-led Sauvignon is an absolute Stellenbosch classic and well worth hunting down despite its higher price point. Now, as I've said, the Morgenster guys love the classics and they push Cabernet Sauvignon and they push Merlot. But when I was working through their range, the single cultivar that excited me the most was Cabernet Franc. And I wasn't alone in that, because winemaker Giulio van Staden completely agreed that in the 2021 vintage, and even as she was vinifying the 2022 vintage, which had yet to be released, Cabernet Franc was just shining the brightest. The way Giulio explains it is that, for a start, the Helderberg is quite a bit cooler than the rest of Stellenbosch, which lies to the north, but it also has a strong, consistent oceanic cooling effect. So while it's not an official wine ward right now, if we look at the map, we can see a very clear-cut amphitheatre, and that amphitheatre opens out right onto the ocean. So even when the days do get hot, that moderating effect from the ocean is really very strongly felt. This is particularly important for Cabernet Franc. Cabernet Franc is a grape that has a very narrow margin for error when you're trying to harvest it correctly. That lower ambient temperature slows the physiological processes in the plant down, and this just widens that window of opportunity ever so slightly, making it easier for harvest teams to hit that sweet spot between weedy Franc on the unripe side and jammy Franc on the overripe side. So when we get into the glass and give this guy a sniff, oh man, it is just so good. Not least of all because of what we just said about that narrow margin for error. If the harvesting team harvested this a few days too early, they'd get cabbage water and sour cherries. And if they harvested a few days too late, then they get plum jam and blackcurrant mixer drink. Here, the balance is just spot on. There are a whole range of categories of aromas that you get. So on the savory side, you have lovely roasted red bell pepper notes, tobacco leaf, and then you have a herbal floral flourish which mixes lavender with cloves and lovely fresh fennel, and that in turn gives way to a kind of minerally graphite note as well as some fresh potting soil. But really, all those notes I just mentioned are merely a decorative lattice work over this core of delightfully pure, clean, ripe black currant, blueberry, and even black cherry fruit. Now, when we give this wine a sip, well, really you get exactly what your mind was preparing itself for with that complex vanguard. All of those elements that we mentioned, the savory and the herbal and the floral and the fruit, mixed together beautifully on the palate, but now you have the added element of texture. They are these beautiful, firm, chalky tannins that really hold everything quite tightly. They have an almost powdery texture to them, like really, really high cocoa content chocolate, sort of 95% lint, which is almost like chewing chalk. And those are set up against the softer, juicier cherry elements that we mentioned from that fruit core. And finally, everything that we've just mentioned lingers quite beautifully on what I would consider to be a fairly generous tail. Okay, so that's all we have time for today. But if you have any questions about the Helderberg would-be wine ward, or about your Lundy van Staden or Morgenster, then drop them onto the site and I will do my best to get back to you. And if you enjoyed the video, then support us on Patreon so that we can produce more of these videos. And subscribe to the Hand Drink Solo YouTube channel, where we publish at least 6 videos each month talking about things like wine science, wine history, unusual cultivars, and some of the rising winemaking stars to come out of the dynamic South African wine.